Dear compatriots and friends, greetings of peace and solidarity. I thank the multi-sectoral organizations of Filipinos in Southern California for sponsoring this forum and for inviting me to speak. Said organizations include the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, Bayan, NAPCON, Ecumenical Forum for Filipino Concerns, and Simbayan for inviting me to this peace forum. I accept the task of discussing what peace and unity in the Philippines means to the millions of Filipino migrants and their families. I am acutely aware of the fact that they are excited about the impending resumption of the formal talks in the peace negotiations between the government of the Philippines, or the GRP, and the National Democratic Front of the Philippines, NDFP. The US-dominated semi-colonial and semi-feudal ruling system of big compradors and landlords is oppressive and exploitative of the toiling masses of workers and peasants, and even of the better educated middle social strata. It is in chronic crisis and engenders social injustice, high rate of unemployment, widespread poverty, and underdevelopment. These dire conditions have resulted in a protracted civil war and the migration of millions of Filipinos to many foreign lands, especially to the US. If the peace negotiations between the GRP and NDFP will come to a happy and successful conclusion, we shall have a government of national unity, peace, and development. We shall be able to assert full national independence and abrogate unequal treaties and agreements. We shall achieve greater democracy through the empowerment of the toiling masses and the middle social strata. The implications and consequences of the peace negotiations go far and beyond the conflicting forces and communities in what is a protracted civil war between the GRP and the NDFP. The achievement of a just and lasting peace benefits the broad masses of the people and the millions of Filipinos who have taken jobs abroad, but who continue to have their close relatives and friends in the Philippines and are always interested in the rights, welfare, and destiny of the Filipino nation. The Filipino migrants working abroad are estimated to be at least 10% of the Philippine population and at least 20% of the labor force. If there were a self-respecting government, independent and determined to develop the economy and generate sufficient jobs, they would rather work and stay in the Philippines with their families and contribute to the accelerated development of the country. They know that they have the knowledge and skills to process the rich natural resources of the country, but these are being grabbed by foreign monopoly corporations with the collaboration of the local oligarchs. So long as the peace process is progressing, even if it has not yet come to a successful conclusion, departments and agencies of the Duterte government can be made to uphold, defend, and promote the rights and interests of the Filipino migrants and their families. Highly qualified and diligent persons who are patriotic and progressive can be placed in government positions to look after the rights and interests of the Filipino migrants and their families. You have a crucial stake in the conduct and success of the GRP-NDFP peace negotiations. You can do a lot by way of encouraging and supporting the peace process in the direction of upholding, defending, and advancing the national and democratic rights and interests of the Filipino people. These override the partisan interests of the conflicting and negotiating parties. The Manila government depends very much on your foreign remittances, and it should heed your demands for favoring the public interest, especially that of the oppressed and exploited masses. We hope that the GRP-NDFP peace negotiations will be successful so that the entire Filipino people will have a wide range of capabilities to develop the country and a wider range of options as an independent, democratic, prosperous, and progressive country in relating the people to the peoples and countries of the world. Thus, let me discuss the background, current status, and prospects of the peace negotiations, and let us draw further whatever is significant or relevant to your present conditions and aspirations. A nationwide civil war exists between the US-dominated, reactionary big comprador landlord government of the Philippines and the People's Democratic Government of workers and peasants, and all the revolutionary forces and people represented by the National Democratic Front of the Philippines. It has been going on since 1969. Since 1992, upon the forging of the Hague Joint Declaration, the two conflicting sides, the GRP and NDFP, have agreed to engage in peace negotiations to address the roots of the armed conflict and to arrive at agreements to lay the basis for a just and lasting peace. Prior to the aforesaid declaration, there was a 60-day ceasefire agreement on November 27, 1986, to create the atmosphere for negotiating and agreeing on the agenda for peace negotiations. But the ceasefire agreement broke down as a result of the Mendiola massacre of peasants and their supporters on January 22, 1987. Taking advantage of the intelligence gathered during the period of ceasefire negotiations and agreement, the Aquino regime launched a brutal military and police campaign against the revolutionary movement. In her own words, Cory Aquino unsheathed the sword of war and launched the US-designed Oplan Lambat Dita. In 1989, when the regime was besieged by worsening political and economic crisis, especially by coup threats from the Reform the Armed Forces movement, Mrs. Aquino sent Representative Jose Villa to the Netherlands to offer peace negotiations to the NDFP. The NDFP accepted the offer with the proviso expressed in an aid memoir to Aquino that the negotiations must be held at a foreign neutral venue in order to avoid the risks and threats of holding the negotiations in the Philippines. The exploratory talks that Representative Yap had with the NDFP were moving towards formal talks in the Netherlands, but the military mutiny headed by Colonel Noble in northern Mindanao in December 1990 had the effect of dissuading the Aquino regime from pursuing the peace negotiations. When Fidel V. Ramos became president in 1992, he sent to The Hague a delegation headed by Representative Jose Villa to forge the framework agreement for the entire peace negotiations, the Hague Joint Declaration of September 1, 1992. The meeting was facilitated by the Institute of International Relations at Klingendahl in the Netherlands. The declaration sets forth the aim of the peace negotiations, which is to address the roots of the armed conflict through agreements that could lay the basis of a just and lasting peace. It states the mutually acceptable principles of national sovereignty, democracy, and social justice as guide. It sets the substantive agenda and method of negotiations and agreement. Soon after the Hague Joint Declaration on October 28, 1992, President Ramos released hundreds of political prisoners from both the revolutionary movement as well as the military mutineers through general amnesty. However, the formation of the National Unification Commission, or the NUC, that tried in vain to carry out so-called peace negotiations interfered with the implementation of the Hague Joint Declaration for nearly 2 years. After the dissolution of the NUC and the formation of the GRP negotiating panel, headed by Ambassador Howard Q.D. in 1994, major agreements were forged by the negotiating parties in quick succession, such as the following: the Brooklyn Joint Statement on June 14, 1994, the Joint Agreement on Safety and Immunity Guarantees, or the JASI, on February 24, 1995, and the agreement on the ground rules of the formal meetings on February 26, 1995. The joint agreement on the formation, sequence, and operationalization of the Reciprocal Working Committee and the additional implementing rules pertaining to the documents of identification and adjusting were solemnly signed on June 26, 1995 at the formal opening of the peace negotiations in Brussels under the facilitation of the Belgian government. The negotiating panels of the GRP and the NDFP succeeded in forging the comprehensive agreement on respect for human rights and international humanitarian law, or CARIL, on March 16, 1998. This fulfills the first of the 4 items in the substantive agenda of the peace negotiations. Other agreements signed on the same day were the additional implementing rules of JASIC pertaining to the security of personnel and consultations in furtherance of the peace negotiations and the joint agreement in support of socio-economic projects of private development organizations and institutes. The GRP-NDFP peace negotiations became paralyzed most of the time during the regimes of Estrada, Arroyo, and Aquino, despite auspicious starts. In common, these post-Ramos regimes are obsessed with seeking the capitulation and pacification of the revolutionary forces and people, instead of addressing the roots of the armed conflict and arriving at agreements to lay the basis for a just and lasting peace. President Estrada made an auspicious start by signing and approving the CARIL on August 11, 1998, in accordance with Memorandum Order Number 9 dated August 7, 1998. But he resented the capture of General Ovidio and Captain Monte Alto by the New People's Army, and the criticisms and opposition of the NDFP to his approval of the Visiting Forces Agreement with the U.S. Thus, he ordered the termination of the JASIG and the entire peace negotiations on May 31, 1999. President Arroyo also made an auspicious start by agreeing with the NDFP the first half of 2011 to foil the assassination plots by the previous regime against the NDFP chief political consultant, the holding of the International Solidarity Conference in support of the Philippine peace process, having the Norwegian royal government as third party facilitator, resuming the formal talks and reaffirming all previous agreements, approving the operating guidelines for the Joint Monitoring Committee, or the JMC, under CARIL, and creating the offices of the secretariats of the GRP and NDFP of the JMC. But in June 2001, the negotiations broke down when the GRP took offense at the killing of the notorious human rights violator Rodolfo Aguinaldo, who resisted the attempt of the NPA to arrest him. The GRP negotiating panel walked out of the peace negotiations despite the obvious absence of a ceasefire agreement with the NDFP. The GRP-NDFP peace negotiations were further paralyzed by the Arroyo regime's unlawful breach of the JASIG by suspending it rather than categorically maintaining it or terminating it. The worst offenses committed by the Arroyo regime against the peace process were the adoption of the U.S. policy of terror, the request to the U.S. government for the designation of the CPP, NPA, and the NDFP chief political consultant as terrorists, and the gross and systematic human rights violations under Opera and Bantaylaya, which included the abduction, illegal detention, torture, and extrajudicial killings of NDFP consultants in the peace process. President Aquino hesitated to resume the peace negotiations with the NDFP. He believed the advice of the U.S., the military, and the Akbayan that the NPA was already a spent force, and became more obsessed with seeking to destroy or rendering the NPA inconsequential through the U.S.-designed military Oplan Bayanihan, the cash doleouts under Pamana of the OPAP, and deployment of more military forces against the NPA by prolonging the ceasefire with the MILF. Upland by any hand has proven to be as vicious and brutal as Upland Batalaya, if not more than so. At the very resumption of talks on February 15 to 21, 2011, the OPA, headed by Teresita Q. Dallas, and GRP negotiating panel headed by Alexander Padilla, qualified the reaffirmation of previous agreements by calling the Hague Joint Declaration a document of perpetual division. From the very beginning, they insisted on the capitulation and pacification of the revolutionary forces and people and refused to recognize the progress already made in the peace process towards the resolution of the armed conflict. They proceeded to declare the JASIG inoperative and refused to allow the reconstitution of the JASIG list of holders of documents of identification. They licensed the military and police to abduct, indefinitely detain, torture, and murder NDFP consultants and other JASIG protected NDFP personnel. They also attacked the Karil as an NDFP propaganda document and caused the arrest and detention of people on trumped-up charges of common crimes despite allegations of being connected with the NPA. The Aquino regime more than doubled the number of political prisoners in violation of the Karil, and in particular the Hernandez political offense doctrine. The emissary of the NDFP, Fidel Villacavili, was able to visit President Duterte 4 times in Davao City after his election and before his oath-taking as president. They were able to discuss many matters and agree to such an extent that their conversations opened wide the way to the resumption of formal talks in the GRP-NDFP peace negotiations. President Duterte has made public pronouncements that have generated goodwill and confidence in connection with the peace negotiations. He has declared that he wishes to consult with the NDFP chief political consultant and that he is willing to release NDFP consultants so that they can participate in the resumption of formal talks in Oslo. His chief negotiator, Silvestre Velio III, has repeatedly declared that previous agreements shall be respected. President Duterte has offered 4 cabinet posts to no less than the CPP and the NDFP and has agreed to the counter-proposal that in the meantime highly qualified persons who are patriotic and progressive can be appointed. Immediately after his oath-taking, even before convening his cabinet, he invited the leaders of the mass organizations demonstrating on Mendiola to present to him the people's agenda for change. Quite a number of revolutionaries have expressed a concern that the key economic and finance posts in the Duterte government are exponents of the already unraveling and discredited neoliberal policy, which favors the foreign monopoly super profiteers, the big compradors and landlords. But I have pointed out that the global and domestic crises are worsening and that the NDFP must use the opportunities outside and inside the peace process to persuade the Duterte government to take a patriotic and progressive position on issues pertaining to national sovereignty, democracy, social justice, development, education, and culture, and international solidarity. The CPP, NPA, and the NDFP have accepted President Duterte's offer of cooperation in cracking down on the manufacture and distribution of illegal drugs, which are ruining the health and lives of millions of people. They have asserted that the right to due process must be respected in the course of the anti-drugs campaign. The drug lords at the highest level and their political, military, and police protectors are the most deserving of combat response when they resist arrest with deadly weapons. But the low-level addicts and small addict pushers deserve to be treated and rehabilitated because they are sick. Let me just inform you of the content of the joint Oslo statement of representatives of the incoming GRP panel and the NDFP panel who held exploratory talks on June 14 to 15, 2016 in Oslo, Norway. under the facilitation of the Royal Norwegian Government as third-party facilitator for the talks, agreed on the following. 1. Formal peace talks will resume in the third week of July 2016 in Oslo, Norway, and shall be conducted in accordance with previously signed agreements by the parties. Third, the parties will discuss the following agenda items during the resumption of the formal talks. A. Affirmation of previously signed agreements. B. Accelerated process for negotiations, including the timeline for the completion of the remaining substantive agenda for the talks, socioeconomic reforms, political and constitutional reforms, and end of hostilities and disposition of forces. C. Reconstitution of the joint agreement on safety and immunity guarantees list. D. Amnesty proclamation for the release of all detained political prisoners subject to concurrence by Congress. E. Mode of interim ceasefire. And number 3. The panel will recommend to President Duterte the following. A. Immediate release of NDFP consultants and other JASIG protected persons in accordance with the JASIG to enable them to participate in the peace negotiations. B. Immediate release of prisoners or detainees based on humanitarian grounds. Let me update you on the preparations for the resumption of formal talks. The formal talks shall not be held in the third week of July as the Oslo statement states, but either from July 27 to August 2 or a later date to give ample time to the side of the GRP to cause immediate release of NDFP consultants and other JASIG protected persons in accordance with the JASIG to enable them to participate in the peace negotiations, as well as immediate release of prisoners, detainees based on humanitarian grounds because they are sickly, elderly, women, and overly long in prison. The affirmation of previous agreements will be easily done in a formal joint declaration because both sides in the opening remarks of their respective chairpersons will already be affirming the agreements. The reconstitution of the list of holders of the document of identification under the joint agreement on safety and immunity guarantees will also be easily done. The NDFP panel will simply provide to the GRP panel for acknowledgement an updated list of the NDFP consultants, security personnel who are entitled to safety and immunity guarantees under JASIG. It will be quite easy to lay out the accelerated process for negotiations, including the timeline for the completion of the remaining substantive agenda for the formal talks, namely socioeconomic reforms, political and constitutional reforms, and end of hostilities and disposition of forces. In accordance with the joint agreement on the formation, sequence, and operationalization of the reciprocal working committees, the reciprocal working committee on the comprehensive agreement on social and economic reforms shall begin work immediately after the first formal talks of the panel, and working groups can also immediately work on the comprehensive agreements on political and constitutional reforms and the end of hostilities and disposition of forces. The negotiating panels will discuss the content and language of the amnesty proclamation which shall release from prison all the current political prisoners. The proclamation shall be issued by the President and shall be subject to the concurrence of a majority of each House of Congress. The Duterte camp has already gained a majority in both Houses of Congress. For the sake of the peace process, even the legislators outside of the Duterte camp can be persuaded to concur with the amnesty proclamation. The NDFP will not agree to an interim ceasefire for the GRP if the current political prisoners are not released through general amnesty. Should there be an interim ceasefire because of the release of the current political prisoners through general amnesty, the interim ceasefire agreement may be done in a single document or in the form of unilateral but simultaneous ceasefire declarations in order to avoid a prolonged negotiation on a single document. The most optimistic estimate is that the 3 remaining comprehensive agreements shall be forged at the rate of 1 for 3 to 6 months, but it remains to be seen how willing is the Duterte government to accept the following. 1. A policy of national industrialization and genuine land reform to develop the Philippine social economy and the Comprehensive Agreement on Social and Economic Reforms. 2. A policy of strong national independence by abrogating unequal treaties and agreements, building a government of national unity, peace and development, and empowering the workers, peasants, women, and indigenous peoples in the Comprehensive Agreement on political and constitutional reforms. And 3. A policy of truce and cooperation with the People's Army and other revolutionary forces, and a process of integration in the socio-economic, political and security system of an independent country in the Comprehensive Agreement on the end of hostilities and disposition of forces. It is one thing to make comprehensive agreements, it's another thing to implement them, but we cannot really go far in discussing the implementation of agreements because we need to make the agreements first in order to see whether the revolutionary forces and the people can accept them as greatly beneficial to them. It is fine if within the first 2 years of the Duterte government the remaining comprehensive agreements are forged so that in the subsequent 4 years there is plenty of leeway for implementation. The U.S. and local reactionary forces are chiefly and overwhelmingly interested in preserving their power and wealth and disarming and dismantling the revolutionary army of the people. For one, the revolutionary forces and the people have to maintain their unity and strength and make sure that the agreements on social, economic, and political reforms are implemented. Thank you.